Back today with Mr. Ian Moore, who's kind enough to do a couple of other episodes for us about scale ship modeling. Before he's talked about the concerns in the field of modeling ships. Last visit he talked to us about rigging and other specific details and techniques for the models. Now he's going to talk to us today about ship colors. He's going to take us through the history of the Canadian Navy and changes that occurred in the colors, the standards, and all the things to be concerned about when modeling Canadian ships. I'll pass it over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity again. It's a very, very controversial topic, coloration, because it's very, very hard to find information on different coloration. There are a lot of references, some of which I have here. Some are better than others, some are more accurate than others, but it's rare that there's that much available. Anyway, Canadian Navy has existed, or Canada has had a Navy for 114 years now. There's been ups and downs as we seem to be better at scrapping ships than we are at building them, but when the time comes, they're there. And we've always managed to get through it. Anyway, starting out 1910, we had a couple of cruisers, one on each coast, the Niobe and the Rainbow. Here's the Rainbow as an example. And again, that's a conversion of a Revell SMS Emden kit, shortened down and fixed up quite a bit to represent her as she was on the West Coast. She actually went to sea and almost had an encounter with the German Pacific Fleet, but she had very little ammunition and very little live ammunition, so it was good that they sort of missed one another in the fog. We also had two destroyers in 1920 and one cruiser in 1920. These were gifts from the British as an imperial gift post-war. The Aurora, which based on the West Coast, was an ex-Jutland survivor. The Patriot and Patrician were the destroyers, and we also had a building program where we built 15 CH-class submarines for the Royal Navy, 2 of which we kept for ourselves. These were all basically scrapped in the early 20s. The 1930 or late 1920 program, we got 2 destroyers that were built specifically for Canada as part of the T-class and the Vancouver and Champlain. And they were basically all we had until the 1930s came along, and we started building some destroyers for ourselves. We built destroyers that came from Britain, and we had at the end of start of 1939, we had 6 destroyers, 4 minesweepers, and a sail training yacht, a 3-masted Blue Nose, basically. Then the war occurred, and there was a huge expansion of the Royal Canadian Navy from 6 ships or 10 ships up to over 400 vessels. And there's a reputation that we were the 3rd largest Navy at the end of World War II. There's a lot of caveats on that. 3rd largest Allied Navy, mainly because most of the Axis navies had disappeared and were wiped out, so it was kind of easy to move up in the ranking. However, it was 5 or 6 years of blood, sweat, and tears to build our fleet and to man it and train it and get the equipment for it, because a lot of it, similar to the first war, the first war for Canada was mainly an army war. We sent a lot of troops overseas. We had a few ships that escorted the troops, but most of the protection of convoys and so on was the responsibility of the Royal Navy through the entire First World War. We did have 60 small wooden drifters that became fishing boats after the war. into the middle of the 30s and 40s. I should go back. Basically, through the First War and up until the Second World War, the standard Admiralty colors were Home Fleet Gray and Foreign Stations Gray, which was a 507C or light gray. And those were pretty standard colors for most of the war and between the wars. It was in 1936, I believe, that CB Confidential Book 3016 defined the Home Fleet Gray and the Foreign Stations Gray as the colors that were to be standard. Having said that, there was a lot of variation. You can notice, for example, the Patrician has decks which are Cortesine, or Semtex rather, which is a light tan color. And that was a non-slip coating that was applied to the deck, and it was never overpainted. Similarly, between the wars, the Cortesine was used, and Cortesine was a pale dull reddish pink color, and again a non-slip coating, not overpainted. So at the beginning of World War II, we had a lot of civilian vessels, tugs, and other auxiliary vessels taken up. We bought 20 armed yachts, or 20 yachts, and armed them from various donors like Eden and the Americans. We also received, we had a building program to build the basic Corvette, the early Corvette style, in Canadian shipyards, and eventually built over 65 of them. The Corvette design escalated and improved, but there were still single screw, one gun depth charges, a couple of anti-aircraft guns. They did improve through the design to an improved long endurance forecastle, a long forecastle increased endurance ships. We also received 8 of the 50 four-stack destroyers that were given to or exchanged to under the Lend-Lease Agreement in 1940 or 41. We received 8 of those. Most of them started out and stayed in haze gray with a dark American deck gray because they had adequate stocks of paint stored amongst their supplies when they were passed over to us. They were in terrible shape, and there was a story in one of them in dry dock. They spent a lot of time crashing in and colliding with things, everything from the Rock of Newfoundland to the oilers and to other convoy ships, because again, in those days there was no radar. And they would lose their engines and go on mechanical and collide with things when they weren't under control. They spent a lot of time in refit and dry dock. So the four-stack destroyers underwent a series of refits every year or two and different changes to their configuration. There are many kits available of four-stack destroyers, everything from the big Revell, John Paul Jones four-stacker right down to the little 700 scale USS Wards and some of those. This one is shown in a Western Approaches camouflage, and again noticeable by the pale grays and blues. Pale greens and blues, which are specific Western Approach colors. We had a building program during the war for Algerine minesweepers and Bangor minesweepers. The Bangors were much smaller and suited for minesweeping. The Algerines, even though they were classed as minesweepers, ended up being convoy escorts for local convoys and even Atlantic convoys. It's noticeable that on a lot of these vessels you will not see any boot topping, because the Admiralty orders were to paint right down to the waterline. So there's some pictures of Sault Ste. Marie, for example, on the Great Lakes, which are color photographed, will be shown at the end of the video. And she is shown with a red water line and camouflaged right down to the water. So during the war, the excuse me, I have to pause for a second. So in the first couple of years of the war, the standard camouflage instructions, and these are available from Sovereign Hobbies in the UK, the Confidential Admiralty Fleet Order, CFO 679, and it defined the colors and gave color swatches for the standard colors. There weren't many. There's the Western Approach colors, for example. It also had color plates that the book contained at least 46 of those. Based on which class of ship it was, there was a specific pattern for that ship. Additional to that, there were both Western Approaches and Light Admiralty Disruptive or Dark Admiralty Disruptive. So there were basically three parts to the same scheme with different colors used. And when a ship changed from one war venue to another, they would often change their camouflage, because the camouflages were based on whether you're out in the Western Atlantic with no background, or if you were working in the Channel or the Bay of Biscay, where you had, or close to the Canadian coast, where you had a lot of background color. It also specified the deck colors to be used with the individual color scheme. These are available through the Sovereign Hobbies website for download and at a cost, but they are based on all original research which the Warship Camouflage Group has done. In 1942, there was a second edition of the Admiralty Fleet Orders, and they came out with as CB 3098, camouflage of ships at sea, and that further defined the reasons and rationale for the different conditions in which camouflage was useful. I mean, it didn't hide ships totally, it just was designed to disguise the course and speed, so targeting would be more difficult. It also introduced a third, so there was a light Admiralty disruptive, a dark Admiralty disruptive, and in 42 they introduced the intermediate Admiralty disruptive scheme, and that also added a couple of additional colors, which I won't go into here. One thing to notice is that the whites are not brilliant whites. The white is an off-white color. It's almost a pearly or ivory white. And I didn't mention, but Canada generally followed the Admiralty instructions because we operated as integral parts of the Royal Navy. Canadians manned a number of U.S. or Royal Naval vessels, and we built ships for the RN, and some of our ships even went to the Americans. The Americans had some of our corvettes, for example. We manned a couple of merchant aircraft carriers or light fleet carriers, all of which were either built in the States or Britain, and Puncher and Nabob stayed as British ships, but they were manned by Canadian crews. Because of lend-lease arrangements, that's the way it had to be worked. So, additional to the corvettes, the Algerons, and the Bangors, as I mentioned, almost all of our ships were small vessels. We didn't have any battleships. We had very few cruisers, and only a couple of aircraft carriers very late in the war. So a lot of the time it was converting merchant vessels. The landing ships, the Prince David, Prince Henry, and Prince Robert, were used as armed merchant cruisers initially, and then later in the war they were converted to landing craft. To at least two of them were, and one was an anti-aircraft cruiser, and they were ex-BC ferries from the British Columbia, and did sterling service during the war. The Royal Navy built a class of ships every year for 10 years prior to the war, the A to I class destroyers. So they had, and these are references that give you a lot of the color schemes for and kit references for the books, and for the A to I class destroyers. Similarly, there's one for British frigates, British destroyers of the J and C class, which Canada used, and Flower class corvettes. The different camouflage schemes as laid out by the CIFO specified the deck color. The deck color would change with the tone of the scheme. If the scheme was a light intermediate scheme, in which the color tone was different and lighter, then the deck color would also change to be lighter rather than a very dark gray. They were usually a G20 or B20, so they'd become a more bluey, lighter color. As I started to say, the Brits built a flotilla of destroyers, 9 destroyers every year for 10 years prior to the war, from the A to the I class. And Canada ended up inheriting pretty well one of the leftovers of each of those classes, because the Royal Navy lost all of the other ships, primarily everything from the Battle of Narvik to the Mediterranean. They lost a lot of destroyers, and so we would get passed down the one remaining destroyer in each class, which we would then use for coastal escorts. The Kootenay is one example in a western approaches camouflage, and Chaudière here is in a Bay of Biscay. And they are very, very similar classes, but it shows the wartime modifications, the use of Hedgehog as a head-throwing weapon, and the darker scheme, as opposed to the Kootenay, which was used for convoy escort and Atlantic work. We did lose a few destroyers during Dunkirk and in the Mediterranean, but not near as many as the Royal Navy did. We lost a couple of corvettes as well. Late in the war, we had tribals built. There were 8 tribals in the Canadian Navy. We lost Athabaskan, and the Iroquois was one of the first built in Britain, hence the dark intermediate scheme, whereas the Haida was a later scheme. Haida is in a war emergency destroyer scheme, which was common as a class scheme. A lot of the schemes that are illustrated in the CAFOs are class specific. For example, the Canadian frigates, as they were built, all those built on the west coast came out in this color scheme. Again, there's a color photo at the end of the presentation, which shows Waskesiu or Wetaskiwin on the west coast. Any on the east coast built were usually in western approaches scheme. This is Annan, which was a frigate that's actually bagged a U-boat. It was a British-built Royal Navy frigate. They didn't have enough men to man it, so they passed it to the Canadian Navy, and it was used in the western approaches, as you can see by the scheme. It has a Semtex deck, which is very, very pale. There are, I think, a picture of a Semtex deck on a frigate, which again may be at the end of the presentation, and it shows that the decks tended to wear down, not wear down, but dirty up fairly significantly. So that pretty well brings us up to the end of the war. Landing craft, again, there are standard schemes for landing craft, usually a B-30 with an off-white or a variation of that. We had several flotillas of LCILs, landing craft at D-Day, supported by the heavier landing ship Large. And again, they were manned by Canadians and did sterling service. This is an example of a old Mirage Flower class corvette converted to a gas bay minesweeper, which was one of the 4 minesweepers. It should have been down here. Started at the First World War. At the start of the Second World War, we had 4 of them in service. We also had several squadrons of motor torpedo boats. This is a D-class MTB. D-class MTBs generally had a blue deck, as did most torpedo boats, to help them blend from the sky. Again, deck colors were less important in camouflage because usually the wake would give away the ship rather than anything else. But if they were stationary or lurking, they would be less visible. Again, they had a blue or a G45, which is a very light gray. Bottoms of torpedo boats generally were copperoid rather than red. And in the last few years, there's been a lot of publication of new information that most capital ship bottoms were different colors. There was the Hood, for example, had a gray bottom. Many of the capital ships had gray bottoms. But it depended, just like with the Japanese Navy, on which shipyard they had been refitted at. There was more than just a red and a gray. There was a number of different colors. I've mentioned before, most corvettes that I certainly have seen and references I've seen have referred to corvettes with black bottoms. But there are occasional photos that show up that show that they may have had red bottoms as well, depending on the time frame. So that takes us to the end of 45. With one exception. This gate vessel, again, is based on a trawler design. That's a World War I battle class trawler, and it's painted green because it was one of our ships that was sunk by a British battleship, the Revenge. The Ypres was a gate vessel in Halifax Harbor in 1940, and couldn't get the gate open fast enough for the Revenge to get through escorting a convoy, so they ran her over. But we still had leftovers from First World War that were used well into the Second. So that brings us up to early 46. Most of the ships that we built during the war were sold or scrapped, and we were left with a core of relatively few ships. However, along came Korea. Korea brought on the need to buy back some of our frigates that had been sold off and convert them to Prestonian class frigates, of which they did 21 conversions. They were then used for training. We also sent tribal class destroyers. As I mentioned, we had built 8 during the war, 4 in the UK and 4 in Canada, or we lost 1. the Tribals and the C-class destroyers. We had 8 ships go to Korea as well. And these were done as you see. There's a significant change. So the resin shipyards folks, Darren and Fred Bustard, have well documented the changes in colors for going forward from World War II, and they were a dark gray 501-102, which was a federal standard. And that's a number under the 1GP12 color charts, which I have a copy of the book here. So these are the colors that were available for use. And the 501-102 was the hull color, and 501-105 was the upper color. Basically a dark gray and a light gray upperworks. That was pretty standard from 1947 right through till 1956. The first Saint Laurent class destroyer, which was a totally Canadian design, from 1949, Saint Laurent was commissioned in the light gray, dark gray color scheme. She had asphalt walkways on her decks as non-slip. And rounded down so to prevent icing and so on, and they were very effective anti-submarine ships. But the rest of the fleet was made up of Algerine class, Bangor class, the odd American minesweeper, and the corvette, the cruiser, of which we had 2 that went to, one of which went to the Coronation, the Quebec and the Ontario. Quebec had been HMS Uganda, HMCS Uganda, and then HMCS Quebec. And these were Canada's dream of having a large blue water navy. We had 2 cruisers, we had a carrier, we had a second carrier come along to replace the first one, which wasn't suitable for Canadian winters, and then an angled deck one. There's no kits that exist of those in 350 scale. We had the Trumpeter Liberty ship, for example, can be converted to the Cape Scott and Cape Breton. We had one in each coast again. They were basic wartime design. That the hull was the same as the Liberty. The superstructure was different, and they were a head class, sort of iron foundries on the water. They were repair ships and escort to support squadrons of minesweepers, which we built a whole range of the Bay class minesweeper. We had 16 of them, and we gave 4 to the French as well, and then replaced them. And they were very, very similar to the British Ton class ships. Submarines. I mentioned we had the CH-14 way back in World War I and 15, and CC-1 and CC-2 in World War I, but they didn't stay. The later, after the war, as we were a anti-submarine Navy, in the 60s we had approximately 60 ships in the Navy, most of which were the variations of the Saint Laurent class. This is Saint Laurent as she was built. This is a similar one of the classmate, the Annapolis, which was the same class or similar class as they were converted to helicopter carriers in the late 60s. As you see, the color scheme has changed. I'll mention that in a moment. We also on the West Coast had one of each of the Tench class and Vallejo class submarines, which we inherited from the U.S. Navy on loan, and they were used as training boats, simply to train our anti-submarine ships in catching subs. We had 4 of the O-boats that were built in Britain and commissioned into the RCN, 3 of which were part of the submarine squadron, and then 1 which was just a hulk that was used for, again, for submarine training. So obviously during the Korean War there were a lot of white highlights added to the vessels. They tiddled them up because the Quebec and the couple of frigates and destroyers went to Spithead for the coronation review of Queen Elizabeth, and just to make the canvas appear more less homely, it was not just painted gray and didn't blend in with the rest of the ship. So 1956 was a year that a lot of color change happened. Let me back up. During the 50s, after Korea or during Korea, we started to shift away from the Royal Navy influence on our colors and paints and moved more towards the American standards. The submarines were black as always. Royal Navy submarines were either blue or olive green, depending on where they were in the home fleet or in the Mediterranean during the war. But post-war, everything started to move towards the black. And as I mentioned, the O-boats were built in Britain for Canada as a standard British design. The 1956, the deck gray became an American gray, 36099. It actually was this gray here, gray 102. Yeah, 102. But then they moved from the GP12 system to using the FS numbers. The helicopter decks and the Bonaventure deck was a very bizarre shade of green, sort of a golfer's green or Brunswick green. And since then, they have been converted and used as a darker 36118 gunship gray color, which is an anti-slip again. A lot of the ships had walkways that were non-slip and were a different color than the regular deck colors. Up until the late 1990s, early 2000s, the below the waterline colors were basically hull red or primer red, and since then they've come around to be a very bright blue, as shown on the Moncton here. The MCDVs and one of each of the Canadian CPF frigates have been repainted in a commemorative camouflage scheme, which commemorates way back when, and it's based on this design here that was used in the Bay of Biscay. Anyway, the current AOPS also is an example here. You can see has the Barber Pole Squadron. A lot of squadron markings were not used well. Canadian naval ships did have pale green maple leaf on their funnels, usually the after funnel if there were more than one, up until 46, and then this new color reference, the BRCN 1100, this is the 64 edition. There was an earlier edition as well, and that changed the color of the maple leaf from green to red. So we've had red maple leaves since then. There was a lot of additional comments. Other types of ships. We had the AOPS there is our current Arctic offshore patrol vessel. We've got 5 under construction or in service, and there'll be another 3 for the Coast Guard. Very lightly armed and good for reasonably light ice, and they'll be patrolling our 3rd coast. Canada has the 2nd longest coastline in the world. Certainly doesn't have the 2nd largest navy. Back in 1955, the Labrador, which was a Canadian naval icebreaker, this is a smaller scale version, was a Northwind class, and the old Revell Northwind kit or Eastwind kit can be used. And she was the first icebreaker to circumnavigate North America. Again, part of the color standards defined in the color references, the hydrographic and research and icebreakers were all white with yellow funnels and masts, and that was part of their differentiation. Hospital ships, we had one in the First World War, and this is Lady Nelson from the Second World War, which is again the old Skywave Hikawa Maru conversion. But they were white with a green riband and red crosses all over them. Although, despite that, the Llanderbury Castle was a hospital ship that was sunk during World War I. Auxiliary vessels, color schemes were different. They were generally black hulls with the light gray upperworks and the gray decks. And the reason for this auxiliary vessel, the Sackville, still exists today is because she was an actual auxiliary vessel post-war and stayed in service because of that. And that's essentially what I've put together. I didn't mention a lot of other schemes that are illustrated in the CAFOs that are available. It covers coastal vessels. It covers post-war fair mile boats, for example. And it colors towards the end of the war. In 44, the schemes went to a light gray with a dark band, and I don't have an example here, but there was a dark band, and they depended on the area of service. The Uganda has often been pictured in that color scheme because she served in the British Pacific Fleet, which wore that scheme D. I think Prince Robert also, I have a picture of her in Vancouver Harbor with the dark blue band on the hull. And it tended to shorten the hull, so camouflage, because of radar, was not very useful at that point. But there were a lot of different schemes. Post-war as well, you'll notice that the life rings and life preservers, if they're at sea, they're wearing red Kisbey rings, and if they're in port, the Kisbey rings were usually white and much more decorative. So the major portion, there's been a wide range of colors depending on the role of the ship, depending on the theater of operation of the ship. Generally, we followed the Royal Navy camouflage patterns and standards up until the end of the war. Post-war, we started migrating towards our own color standards. Ships being a darker gray in Korea, for example, similar to the Americans, but not the same. And we did experiment with a gray color, haze gray. One of our destroyer steamers was painted that color. Other things to notice, that mast tops are almost always white. The masts tend to be black at the level of the funnel, and because they get stained with smoke quite a lot. The cruiser is probably a better example. So upper white masts to be less visible against the horizon, and the black just to hide the soot from the funnels. Kisby rings went the range from being a bright yellow orangey color and late in the war, here we are, late in the war they were painted segments of red and green, red and yellow for visibility to show and pick up the survivors a little more carefully. So there can be a lot of color on ships. And I hope that that may be useful. There are and were more than 80 classes of ships in the Canadian Navy, some of which only had one or two, some of which had a couple of dozen, or frigates, for example. We built more than 65, corvettes 132 or so, and it's a fascinating subject. I hope that is of interest to you. Thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, please let Bill know and he'll pass them along.
Very good. Thank you for doing this, and thanks for putting all those models. They look fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
It's a big topic. I guess it's all about the references, really.
That's exactly right.
Even a reference can be incorrect. So
Yes,
for the latest.
some of I was told yesterday that some of these earlier references, the warship perspectives, which I've always sworn by, they are good for schemes, but they may not be exactly right for colors. I was advised yesterday, and I meant to say that basically British colors used to be ABC, 507A, 507B, and 507C. 507C is a very light gray, which is used pretty standard on British warships. 507A and B, I was told yesterday, are the same color, even though companies like, and I forgot to mention, the Vallejo has a color chart which gives you this is adapted from Resin Shipyards and Vallejo, which gives you Vallejo matches for a lot of the colors that are listed, both by FS number and by the GP number, RCN GP number, when they were in use. So the old paint standard used to be Humbrol. Vallejo paints are used very often now. Life Color makes some very good sets that Bill has had here in the store for Royal Navy, both Western approaches and more capital ship grays. I didn't mention, I mentioned in passing the 1943. They introduced the intermediate scheme, and they brought in additional colors at that point, and those were, as illustrated on the back of some of these magazines, the gray, black, grays and blues, as opposed to the original pre-war, which includes the deck colors, the off-white, Western approaches, and the MS colors, which were used quite a lot. The MS colors eventually became the 507 colors, just got renamed. There was also rare use of Mountbatten pink. I don't have any reference of any Canadian ships ever using Mountbatten pink per se. I do have a picture in the group at the end of the video that shows a number of ships using PB10 or a dark blue, which I presume is PB10. And it's also used in the commemorative camouflage schemes. Anyway,
A couple other things.
don't keep me going.
Confuse the issue, right?
Yeah,
Is
there's
discerning color from black and white photos.
You-
That's always a problem.
almost impossible to do so unless you have a contemporary reference somewhere.
And in our modern era of computers and whatnot, you're getting a proliferation of colorized photos.
Yes,
So the
yeah.
colorizer is kind of taking some artistic license with what he's doing with these things.
Yeah, a lot of people will ask the Warship Camouflage Group or some other expert forum for advice as to what are the colors on this black and white photo, and if they dare send in a photo that's been colorized, they won't even get an answer, which is unfortunate because people are desperate to know. We all want to know. These have come a long way from the days back when we were doing the Airfix kits with a can of grape Humbrol paint, and things have progressed.
Well, thanks again. We appreciate it.
My
Again,
pleasure.
If you have a question for Ian, please send it to us. Drop a comment below if you have anything to add. If you'd like to see Mr. Moore come back and do more about ships, what kind of topics would you like to see him cover? And as always, thanks for watching.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, don't forget, please subscribe, slap that bell, hit that like button, and join Team Hobby Center.